domain and social movement was the temperance movement, millions of members, a strong also involvement of women in the fight then against alcoholism, and yes, leading ultimately also to the prohibitions first in several US states prior to World War I, and then the famous national prohibition after the First World War. The suffrage movement was another important movement at the time. Also, the land reform movement, also called single tax movement. Henry George wrote a best-selling book about poverty and progress in the United States, where he saw basically the monopoly of land rents as the main problem for why there was a simultaneous existence of both high levels of poverty and high levels of wealth in the United States. And he suggested to tax at 100% all land values and their increments in order to finance the state only with this just single tax. And in a way, keeping private property, but socializing all land value gains. Henry George also ran for mayor unsuccessfully in New York and was the founder also of this land reform movement. Child labor and democratizing education were also important social policy goals at the time. Also, if you want the origins of the consumers movement and the fight for consumer rights with the National Consumers League, important with Florence Kelley, a collaborator also of Jane Addams as its president. Obviously, working conditions with not only sort of trade unions being involved here, but also early sociologists involved in the so-called cooperativism movement, which suggested cooperatives both in production and consumption as an alternative form of organizing capitalism. Profit-sharing schemes also being proposed by these social reformers. Crime was both an object then of early sociology, but also of social reformers at the time. The United States always had a much higher crime rate than Europe, even though, let's say, sociology of crime did also exist in Europe. It was much more a topic in the US context. Work accidents, so the first actually social insurance that was passed in most countries, including the United States, were worker compensation laws, where the insurance of work accidents was first of all made mandatory and shifted then to the responsibility of employers. Last but not least, I already mentioned the peace movement, where many of the early sociologists organized with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom also being an important actor present at the Versailles the treaty negotiations. Many of the early sociologists remember also Webb Du Bois' career moved into the fight for international peace in and after World War I. All right, so these were just little overview of the different kind of social movements associated with early sociology. Now let's move to a brief juxtaposition of what American sociology was about with the classical thinkers. So what were some of the main objections that American sociology implicitly had? So first of all, in a settler society that consisted of high rates of immigrants, high rates of immigration, social change, modern social order was not seen as something statically given, but rather as something always renegotiated, always newly defined. So many of our European thinkers were still implicitly drawn to a juxtaposition of the old feudal traditional society or community and then the modern socially differentiated a society with its division of labor and so on. And these kind of two-step models is not something that you will find in American sociology. This also goes hand in hand with a shift from, let's say, more macro to micro sociology. So we will see that many of the community studies, but also the theory like symbolic interactionism, are about micro-sociology. We have seen this already a little bit in European sociology with Georg Simmel, and perhaps also in the action model of Max Weber. But particularly when you think about Durkheim and structural functionalist kind of sociology, this is very macro, and it takes in the US up to Talcott Parsons to develop such a broad macro sociology. So you may have also noticed that many of the European sociologists settled on a rather pessimistic note about the state of modern societies. Durkheim pointing to the anomic states, Max Weber's iron cage metaphor, Marx crises, so Simmel pointing to the monetary system being decoupled from concrete life in his philosophy of money. So rather pessimistic diagnoses of modern society. And this is a little bit different, again, in the US context, where just this idea that new social orders can always be renegotiated and that every challenge sort of has its own social reform makes American sociology more optimistic. And American sociology also has had a much closer link to social work and also policies of urban reform. Last but not least, you may have noticed that the many broad distinctions that European sociologists offered in terms of the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the community and society, are not necessarily sufficient to comprehend the nature of these immigrant societies, such as the United States. So many of these American sociologists then also drew on a different set of theories than did the European sociologists. And just as a little reminder here, pragmatism was one of the roots then of this early American sociology. Just a little reminder here, pragmatism associated with figures such as Pierce James Dewey or Jane Addams also was in a way an answer to that stalemate between German idealism and British empiricism, on the other hand, with this idea of solving philosophical problems in a very pragmatic way, in a trial and error function that also dominates, for instance, experiments. This also was the answer to a Cartesian kind of metaphysics and representationalist notions of truth, both moral and sort of epistemic truth, with the idea of just using practical experimental sort of settings in order to solve these kind of problems. And many of these pragmatist roots then also visible in the sociologists of the Chicago School. And one important consequence of this is what may be called a pragmatist model of action. And I refer here to Jens Beckert's reconstruction of this model of action, where he opposes this model also to what nowadays we would call rational choice. So rational choice, we will get to this in a couple of lectures later, is older actually than the rational choice movement of the post-Second World War era. The methodological discussion or dispute in the 19th century between the German historical school and German economists of the time was already about whether an ahistoric model of action, that is starting from individual rational actors pursuing their self-interest, would be adequate to understand social action. And then the German historical school very much opposed this kind of model of action, where then the economists went for starting or making this rational actor model the starting point, mainly for understanding economic behavior, but ultimately also all kind of social action. So just briefly, what is the rational choice or rational actor model? In a way, remember Max Weber's different types of rationality and different types of action. The rational choice model makes the instrumental rationality in Weber and the instrumental model of action the only action type around. So in rational choice world, you start from individual actors, so you have a methodological and ontological kind of individualism, and this rational actor has given preferences about the states of the world, has a complete knowledge about different probabilities with which different outcomes may be reached, and then goes around the world calculating in a way the different outcomes to define a utility function, and ultimately maximizes then the utility given just the self-interested kind of preferences and instrumental rationality. Other actors in this view are only seen as constraints, in a way as a cost ingredient in the utility functions. And we are also talking about already made actors. So in the rational choice model, there's no narrative about how these actors obtain their preferences, obtain their, let's say, skills in the exercise of rational calculations, how they obtain language, etc. So these are already socialized, completely socialized actors. This is not a made topic in rational choice theories. And this is very much different from the pragmatist point of view, where so first of all, actors always have a practical background knowledge and are rooted in routines. Yeah, so they use reflexive rules of appropriateness. That is, instead of always starting a new calculation of what to do and of what not to do, actors just have their routines. They